Hello and welcome to the How Not to Screw Up Your Kids podcast, the bucket emptying episodes. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Han. So, pour yourself a cuppa, find a comfy seat and enjoy the conversation. Now, we've just come back from a couple of days at a school show and we took with us the bucket for a live explanation really. And so I really wanted to hop on and do an episode specifically on this. So if you are listening to the audio version, I would highly recommend that you find some time to head to the YouTube channel and actually see the visual, because you'll be able to see it quite practically. It's a really helpful and useful thing to do. So as you can see here, I've got one of those lovely Kilner jars with the tap. So the idea is when we're talking about buckets, and hence why we have the bucket emptying episodes, is that we all have a bucket, our children and ourselves, and that bucket fills throughout the day. But usually we don't pay attention to what's been filling the bucket until that last drop spills everything over, and then either we or our children lose our temper, burst into tears, feel overwhelmed. So what typically happens is we forget that there's a whole load of things that have been building up during the day, and we tend to focus on that last thing that tipped it. Now, obviously, that last thing that tipped it has some relevance, but really understanding the root causes and the cumulative things that affect it is actually much more helpful to do. So that's the first bit. It's understanding what are the things that go into our children's bucket that then have them overflowing, what goes into our bucket that then has it overflowing. So that's one piece. But a really crucial part which we often forget is what empties it. Now, the reason why I like the Kilner jar particularly is that it has a tap on it. And this is a really great analogy for us emptying our bucket, because the tap can turn two ways. We turn it one way, we think we are emptying the bucket, but in fact we're not. So it's being able to really understand what are the things that genuinely empty our bucket. So for example, as adults, we may think that scrolling through our social media is helping empty our bucket. Children may feel that being on their phones or their iPads empty their bucket, or watching television. Now, I'm not anti any of those, but what I will say is what typically happens with those is that they scrolling mindlessly on phones, playing games or watching television presses pause. That's all it does. It doesn't actually physically empty your bucket, because what usually then happens is all of the chatter, all of the worries, all of the anxieties and the stress then come back as soon as we've stopped doing that. And it's one of the classic challenges that we see when children have been on devices or watching television or gaming, and then they come off those not long before they go to bed, because that's simply pressed pause on all of that chatter and that overwhelm. That's often where we see children and teens then struggling to fall asleep at night, because they haven't yet given themselves an opportunity to genuinely empty their bucket. So I think it's a really helpful thing to kind of understand that. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't scroll, doesn't mean that they can't watch television. It just means we need to be mindful of when that happens in the sequence, because that whole bucket emptying is really crucial. Otherwise, children are always waking up each and every day with a bucket probably 2/3 or even 3/4 full before they've even started. Now, at the show, we took some ping pong balls, white ping pong balls for the things that went into our children's buckets, and then orange ping pong balls for the things that emptied their bucket. And we asked children to write on the ping pong balls and pop them in. So I've got some here that I want to share, because it's a really useful thing for us to be able to understand. So here are some of the white ones. So we had, don't know if you can see, homework. We had my sister, but that can be siblings. It could be anything in that. So these are some of the things that the children were saying filled their bucket, caused that overwhelm, caused that build up, that stress, that anxiety. Things that when you can't do something. We've got when I'm bored. So some children were talking about actually the whole process of being bored and not knowing what to do filled their bucket. And then we had one that talked about iPad. Now, the iPad, it wasn't being given the iPad, it was when the iPad was taken away. That was part of the filling up. So that was some of them. That's just 5 of them. As you can see from the jar, we've got a lot more there, but I just pulled out a few. So we then asked children, okay, if these are the things that are going in and filling your bucket and causing that overwhelm and causing that frustration, what might be some of the things that empty your bucket? And these are the ones that they came out with. So they came out with play, eating, cooking or baking, being outdoors. We've got reading, and we've got listening to music. Now, again, just 5 that we've just sort of picked out. And what's important to remember with what goes in the bucket, it will be very individual. And there are some things that are quite repetitive and common to each day that will fill a child's bucket. And some of those things will be small amounts. So it takes quite a lot of them before the bucket overflows. For some children, it will be a small number of things that fill the bucket, but fill them really quickly. So if you've got a child, for example, who is very anxious about going to school, struggling with friendships, it may be the whole process of going into school gets their bucket 3/4 full. So it doesn't need very much to tip it over. So it's recognizing that what fills the bucket will be different, and then what empties it will be different. But it's being able to recognize and understand where you are in that bucket filling process. So if you've got a child who struggles with school, understanding that that's a huge part of filling their bucket, and then also helping them understand what are the things that I need to do that actively help empty my bucket, and how do I make sure that I schedule time for that bucket emptying stuff to happen, so that we can then make sure that at the beginning of each day, our bucket is close to empty as is possible. So it's a really useful exercise. Now, in the free resource library, remember www.drmaryhan.com/library, we have got the free resource. We've got this particular resource that you can have available to you. All you need to do is download it, and you can have those conversations with your children. And they might not know initially what are the things that fill their bucket. They might have absolutely no clue about what are the things that might empty their bucket, but we can approach it with curiosity. Yep. So why don't we use it as a bit of a journaling exercise across a week? Let's look at some of the things, reflect back on the end of the day. What are the things that cause me a bit of overwhelm, a bit of stress, a bit of irritation, a bit of annoyance? Those are the things that went into my bucket. And then experimenting. Well, why don't I try listening to some music? Why don't I try going outside and jumping on a trampoline? If you've got a pet, maybe taking the pet for a walk or spending time with the pet. It's really approaching it from that genuine curiosity, because there are some things that will empty your bucket one day, but may not be as effective on another day. So it's that whole, we're filling our toolbox with things that we can dip in and out of when we need them, and seeing how effective that they are. So it's that reflective piece of being able to understand what are the things that fill my bucket, as well as understanding what are the things that I might try that might empty my bucket. So I hope that that was useful to actually see the visual and some of the narratives that young children have actually given us straight from their mouths, and that short explanation it's amazing how insightful children can be when we really sort of ask those questions and afford them those opportunities. Now, as ever, if you have enjoyed this episode, I would be eternally grateful if you could rate, follow, and review this podcast, and also share with friends, with family, with anyone else who might be interested in raising resilient adults, so that others can find us and we can spread the love. So, until next time.